In the velvet shadows of the night train to Berlin, a luxurious 1920s journey turns deadly when a German diplomat is found stabbed in his locked compartment, a cigar's smoke curling through the air. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster from a quiet English village, whose knack for unravelling secrets is unmatched. As the train speeds toward Berlin, she uncovers a web of espionage, greed, and hidden pasts among a flamboyant opera singer, a probing journalist, a nervous young wife, and a mysterious Russian countess. With a torn scrap of paper, a scratched window, and a trail of lies, Miss Marple races to expose a killer before the train reaches its final stop. Suspense, betrayal, and human nature collide in this gripping Agatha Christie-style mystery. Will the truth derail the journey? Chapter 1. The Invitation. In the tranquil village of Danefield, where the hedgerows bloomed with late summer roses, and the church clock chimed with unhurried precision, Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest parlour. Her knitting needles moved with a rhythmic clack, crafting a pale blue shawl for a neighbour's newborn. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn but polished oak table. On this table rested a letter, its crisp envelope bearing a German postmark and an elegant looping script that spoke of refinement. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and reread the letter, her lips pursed in thought. It was an invitation from Lady Beatrice Langley, a dear friend from her schoolgirl days, now a literary patroness of some renown. Beatrice was hosting a symposium in Berlin, a gathering of writers, scholars, and enthusiasts to discuss the enduring allure of detective fiction. The journey, Beatrice wrote, would be aboard the night train to Berlin, a marvel of modern travel with its mahogany-panelled carriages and promise of continental elegance. "Do come, Jane," the letter urged. "Your sharp mind would enliven our discussions, and I dare say you'll find the journey as stimulating as the symposium itself." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. She was no stranger to the undercurrents that flowed beneath polite society, and the prospect of a train filled with strangers, each with their own secrets, stirred her curiosity. Danefield, for all its charm, had grown quiet of late, and her last adventure, a curious case involving a missing vicarage teapot, had been pleasantly diverting but hardly taxing. She folded the letter, her decision made. A journey to Berlin would be just the thing to shake the cobwebs from her mind. By noon she had packed her modest suitcase, a few sensible dresses, her best hat with the velvet trim, and a small notebook for jotting observations. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Hartnell, bustled about, muttering about foreign trains and the perils of travel. "Mind you don't catch a chill, Miss Marple," she said, pressing a thermos of tea into her hands. Miss Marple smiled, accustomed to such fussing, and promised to write from Berlin. The Danefield station was a hive of activity when Miss Marple arrived, her tweed coat buttoned against the autumn breeze. The night train to Berlin stood gleaming on the platform, its black locomotive puffing steam like a proud beast. The carriages, adorned with gold lettering and crimson curtains, exuded an air of opulence that seemed almost theatrical. A porter took her suitcase, and she stepped aboard, her senses alert to the hum of anticipation among the passengers. Her compartment was a cosy affair, with plush seats and a small table bearing a vase of fresh lilies. As she settled in, she observed her fellow travellers through the open door. Madame Clara Voss, a celebrated opera singer with a cascade of auburn hair, swept past, her fur stole trailing like a royal train. Her laughter was loud, but her eyes darted nervously as if expecting an audience. Herr Wilhelm Brandt, a German diplomat with a stern jaw and impeccable suit, moved with the precision of a man accustomed to authority. His briefcase clutched tightly. A young English couple, Roger and Evelyn Trent, boarded with the eagerness of newlyweds, though Evelyn's smile seemed strained as Roger whispered urgently to her. Most intriguing was Countess Irina Volkov, a Russian émigré whose pale beauty and guarded expression suggested a story untold. She carried a single leather case, her gloved hands betraying a faint tremble. Miss Marple's compartment neighbour, a talkative elderly gentleman named Mr. Pritchard, introduced himself as a retired bookseller. "Off to Berlin for the symposium, I presume?" he asked, peering over his spectacles. Miss Marple nodded, her reply vague but encouraging. Mr. Pritchard chattered on about the train's history, its route through war-torn lands, and the glamour of its passengers. "They say this train carries more secrets than luggage," he said with a chuckle, unaware of how his words sharpened Miss Marple's attention. As the whistle blew and the train lurched forward, Miss Marple gazed out the window at the receding platform. The fields of Danefield gave way to rolling hills, and the clatter of wheels on tracks became a soothing rhythm. Yet beneath her calm exterior, her mind was already at work, cataloguing faces, gestures, and the subtle tensions that hung in the air like the faint scent of Madame Voss's perfume. Something told her this journey would be more than a literary excursion. In her experience, where people gathered, secrets followed, and secrets, she knew, had a way of unravelling. Chapter 2. The Midnight Disturbance. The night train to Berlin sliced through the darkened countryside, its wheels humming a steady cadence against the tracks. The hour was late, and the opulent carriages, bathed in the soft glow of shaded lamps, had settled into a hush, broken only by the occasional creak of wood or the distant clink of glass from the dining car. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her compartment, had not yet retired. Her knitting lay untouched on the small table, the pale blue wool glinting faintly in the lamplight. Sleep, she found, was less compelling than the subtle undercurrents she sensed among the passengers. Her sharp eyes, accustomed to the nuances of village life in Danefield, were equally adept at detecting the unspoken tensions that lingered in the air like an approaching storm. She had spent the evening in the dining car, observing her fellow travellers over a modest supper of consommé and poached salmon. Madame Clara Voss had dominated the conversation, her voice rising in theatrical flourishes as she recounted tales of her triumphs on the Vienna stage. Her auburn hair gleamed under the chandeliers, but Miss Marple noted the way her hands fluttered, betraying a nervousness her laughter could not mask. Herr Wilhelm Brandt, the German diplomat, had eaten alone at a corner table, his stern face buried in a newspaper, though his eyes flicked upward whenever Madame Voss's voice grew too loud. Roger and Evelyn Trent, the young English couple, had sat close together, their conversation hushed but intense, Roger's hand resting possessively on his wife's arm. Countess Irina Volkov, elegant in a black silk gown, had dined sparingly, her gaze distant as if her thoughts were elsewhere. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, had catalogued these details, her mind weaving a tapestry of possibilities. Now back in her compartment, she sat with a book unopened in her lap, her thoughts on the passengers. The train's rhythm was soothing, yet she remained alert, her instincts honed by years of unravelling human motives. It was just past midnight when a sudden sound shattered the quiet, a sharp, piercing cry, followed by the rapid patter of footsteps in the corridor. Miss Marple set her book aside, her heart quickening not with fear, but with curiosity. She rose, slipping on her soft felt slippers, and opened her compartment door just enough to peer out. The corridor was dimly lit, the velvet curtains swaying slightly with the train's motion. Pierre, the conductor, a wiry man with a perpetually anxious expression, hurried past, his face pale. His uniform was slightly askew, as if he had been roused from sleep. Miss Marple stepped into the corridor, her movements silent, and followed at a discreet distance, her slight figure blending into the shadows. The footsteps led to the private compartments at the end of the carriage, where the more affluent passengers were housed. As she approached, she heard a woman's voice, high and trembling, emanating from the direction of Herr Brandt's compartment. "He's dead! Mon Dieu, he's dead!" The words were laced with a theatrical wail, unmistakably Madame Voss's. Miss Marple quickened her pace, arriving at the open door of Brandt's compartment to find a small crowd already forming. Madame Voss stood in the centre, her fur stole slipping from her shoulders, her hands clutching a glass of red wine that threatened to spill. Pierre hovered nearby, wringing his hands while Mr. Pritchard, the talkative bookseller, peered over his spectacles, his curiosity undisguised. Miss Marple slipped into the compartment, her presence unnoticed amid the chaos. Herr Wilhelm Brandt lay slumped across a small mahogany desk, his head resting on a blotter stained with ink. A silver letter opener, its handle engraved with intricate filigree, protruded from his chest, a dark stain spreading across his pristine white shirt. His eyes were open, fixed in a stare that suggested surprise rather than fear. The compartment was a study in order disrupted. A glass of brandy had tipped over, its contents pooling on the desk. A single leather glove lay discarded on the floor, and the window, though locked, bore a faint smudge of condensation as if someone had pressed against it. Pierre, regaining some composure, announced that he would fetch the train's doctor. "Please, everyone, return to your compartments," he urged, his voice cracking. But Madame Voss, her face flushed, refused to move. "I heard a noise, a dreadful noise," she said, her eyes wide. "I came to see, and, oh, it's too horrible." Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, noted the opera singer's trembling hands, and the way her gaze darted toward the corridor, as if expecting someone to appear. The doctor, a portly man named Dr. Leclerc, arrived promptly, his medical bag in hand. He knelt beside Brandt, his fingers probing for a pulse before shaking his head. "He's been dead for perhaps an hour," he said, his French accent clipped. "The wound is precise, straight to the heart." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A precise wound suggested intent, not accident, and the letter opener was an unusual choice, intimate yet deliberate. She stepped closer, her gaze sweeping the compartment. The air carried a faint, acrid scent, not brandy, but something sharper, like cigar smoke. Yet Brandt's desk held no ashtray, no sign of smoking. She recalled Roger Trent lighting a cigar in the dining car, his hands steady as he struck the match. Could he have been here? Her eyes fell on a small detail. A folded newspaper, its edge slightly torn, tucked beneath Brandt's arm. She made a mental note to examine it later, if permitted. Madame Voss, now seated on a velvet bench, was fanning herself with a lace handkerchief. "I barely knew him," she said, unprompted, her voice a touch too insistent. "We spoke once, about music, nothing more." Miss Marple, with her gentle smile, nodded, but her mind registered the opera singer's defensiveness. Mr. Pritchard, lingering at the door, muttered something about the dangers of night trains, his earlier joviality replaced by unease. Pierre, desperate to restore order, ushered the onlookers away, but Miss Marple lingered a moment longer. She noticed the locked window again, its latch gleaming in the lamplight. It was secure, yet the smudge intrigued her. Danefield, she had once solved a theft by noticing a similar mark on a window pane. A gardener's boy, careless with his ladder. Here the implications were far graver. She stepped back as Dr. Leclerc covered Brant's body with a sheet, his movements brisk but respectful. As she returned to her compartment, the train's rhythm seemed to mock the stillness of the scene she had left. Miss Marple sat by her window, the dark landscape blurring past, and considered the passengers. Madame Voss's histrionics, Roger and Evelyn's whispered intensity, Countess Volkov's enigmatic reserve, all were threads in a pattern she could not yet discern. But one thing was certain. The night train to Berlin was no longer merely a journey. It was a stage, and a murder had set the drama in motion. She picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their steady click, but her thoughts were far from the pale blue shawl. They were with the dead man, the cigar smoke, and the secrets that waited to be unravelled. Chapter 3. The Passenger's Secrets. The first light of dawn crept through the heavy curtains of the night train to Berlin, casting a pale glow over the polished wood and plush upholstery of the carriage. The train, halted at a small station in the German countryside to await local authorities, hummed with a restless energy. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease, while the rhythmic clatter of the wheels was replaced by the murmur of speculation. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the dining car with a cup of tea, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her delicate hands rested on the table, but her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The news of Herr Wilhelm Brandt's death had spread like wildfire, and the atmosphere was thick with suspicion. Pierre, the conductor, moved among the passengers, his anxious demeanour barely concealed by his crisp uniform. He had announced that the train would remain stationary until the police conducted preliminary inquiries. A decision that did little to calm the growing tension. Miss Marple, known in Danefield for her knack for unravelling village intrigues, had been approached by Pierre at first light. "You have a reputation, mademoiselle," he said, his French accent tinged with desperation. "Perhaps you could observe until the authorities take over?" Miss Marple, with a modest smile, agreed to lend her eyes and ears, though she suspected her role would extend beyond mere observation. She began her inquiries with the tact of a seasoned confidant, her gentle questions disarming even the most guarded passengers. Her first conversation was with Madame Clara Voss, who sat in a corner of the dining car, her auburn hair slightly dishevelled, her fur stole draped carelessly over her shoulders. The opera singer's eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from grief or lack of sleep, Miss Marple could not yet determine. "It's dreadful, simply dreadful," Madame Voss declared, her voice carrying the cadence of a stage performance. To think such a thing could happen on this train. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. You mentioned last night that you barely knew Herr Brandt, she said, her tone conversational. Yet, I understand you spoke with him about music? Madame Voss's fingers tightened on her coffee cup. Oh, a passing word, nothing more, she said, her laugh a touch too bright. He was interested in my career, that's all. But as she spoke, Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in her eyes, and the opera singer let slip a curious detail. Brandt had once accused her of involvement in a financial scandal tied to a Viennese opera house, a matter she dismissed as malicious gossip. Miss Marple's mind filed this away, recalling a similar case in Danefield, where a choir treasurer's gossip had masked a deeper truth. Next, she turned her attention to Roger and Evelyn Trent, the young English couple who sat at a nearby table, their breakfast untouched. Roger, a journalist with a lean frame and restless energy, was scribbling in a small notebook, his brow furrowed. Evelyn, pale and delicate, kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes darting to her husband's notes. Miss Marple approached with a warm smile, offering condolences for the shock of the night's events. It must be unsettling, especially on such a pleasant journey, she said, settling beside them. Roger's pen paused, and he met her gaze with a guarded smile. It's a grim business, he said. I'm writing a piece on it for my paper. Brandt was a big fish. Diplomatic circles, you know. I was digging into his connections for a story. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. A story? How fascinating. Was Herr Brandt cooperative? Roger hesitated, then admitted he had approached Brandt in the dining car the previous evening, seeking an interview. He wasn't keen, Roger said, his tone bitter. Told me to mind my own business. Evelyn, speaking for the first time, added softly, We were together all evening, weren't we, Roger? Her voice held a note of insistence, and Miss Marple noted the way Roger's hand brushed hers, as if to reassure or silence. The discrepancy in their manner intrigued her. Evelyn's nervousness suggested more than mere shock at a stranger's death. Countess Irina Volkov proved the most elusive. Miss Marple found her in the lounge car, seated alone with a book of Russian poetry, her black silk gloves a stark contrast to the pale pages. The Countess's beauty was striking, but her expression was impenetrable, like a lake frozen over. Miss Marple, undeterred, engaged her in light conversation about the symposium in Berlin. I understand you're a patron of the arts, she said, her tone admiring. The Countess's lips curved in a faint smile. I support what moves me, she replied, her accent soft but precise. When Miss Marple gently steered the conversation to Brandt, the Countess's composure remained intact, though her fingers paused on the book's edge. I knew him only in passing, she said, a diplomat, nothing more. Yet, when Miss Marple mentioned a vague rumour of Brandt's wartime activities, the Countess's eyes flickered, and she murmured something about old wounds best left untouched. It was a slip, small but significant, and Miss Marple's mind tucked it away like a precious clue. As the morning wore on, the passengers grew restless, their alibis and motives forming a complex web in Miss Marple's thoughts. Madame Voss's financial scandal hinted at a grudge. Roger's journalistic probing suggested a professional vendetta, and the Countess's guarded demeanour pointed to a past she wished to conceal. Even Mr. Pritchard, the bookseller, had let slip that he had seen Brant arguing with someone in the corridor before dinner, though he claimed not to recognize the other party. Miss Marple, sipping her now cold tea, reflected on the passengers' stories, each laced with half-truths and omissions. She thought of a Danefield gardener who once lied about a broken fence, his fibs unravelling when she noticed the dirt on his boots. Here, the dirt was less tangible, but the signs were there. In a glance, a pause, a too-quick denial. The train's temporary halt had drawn a small crowd of local police, their uniforms stark against the station's rustic platform. They conferred with Pierre and Dr. Leclerc, their voices low but urgent. Miss Marple watched from the dining car window, her mind turning over the scene in Brant's compartment. The letter opener, the spilled brandy, the faint cigar smoke. Each detail was a thread, and she sensed the pattern was beginning to emerge. As the passengers dispersed to their compartments, their faces etched with unease, Miss Marple remained at her table. Her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from the stitches. The night train to Berlin, she knew, was a microcosm of human nature, where secrets festered and motives intertwined. And she, with her quiet persistence, was determined to untangle them before the journey's end. Chapter 4. The Clue in the Cigar. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the platform, where the night train to Berlin stood motionless. Its gleaming carriages, an incongruous sight against the backdrop of a sleepy German station. The local police, their boots crunching on the gravel, moved with methodical precision, interviewing the conductor and inspecting Herr Wilhelm Brandt's compartment. Inside the train, the air was thick with unease, the passengers' faces betraying a mixture of impatience and dread. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained a picture of composure, seated in her compartment with her knitting in her lap, her mind as active as ever. The events of the night had sharpened her senses, and she was determined to piece together the puzzle before the authorities took full control. With Pierre's reluctant permission, Miss Marple returned to Brandt's compartment, now cordoned off but accessible to her, due to her quiet insistence and reputation for discretion. The space felt colder now, the weight of death lingering despite the morning light filtering through the locked window. The letter opener, still embedded in Brandt's chest, had been left untouched for the police, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to smaller details. The spilled brandy glass, now dry, had left a faint ring on the mahogany desk. The single leather glove, discarded on the floor, bore no monogram but was of fine quality, suggesting wealth or care. Most intriguing, however, was the faint scent of cigar smoke that still hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the compartment's otherwise pristine order. Miss Marple knelt beside the desk, her movements careful, and examined an ashtray tucked into a corner. It held a half-burned cigar, its wrapper partially intact, the brand just legible, Havana Royale. She recalled Roger Trent lighting a similar cigar in the dining car the previous evening, his fingers deft as he struck a match. Brandt, she had noted, showed no signs of being a smoker. His desk was free of tobacco stains, and his clothes carried no such odour. The cigar, then, was an anomaly, a clue that pointed to an intruder. But why leave it behind? Carelessness or a deliberate misdirection? Her attention shifted to a torn scrap of paper, barely visible beneath the desk's edge. She retrieved it with a handkerchief, careful not to disturb the scene. The fragment was small, no larger than a postage stamp, and bore the initials IV in a looping script, followed by a partial address, Kurfürstendamm 2. The rest was missing, but the street name was unmistakably Berlin's, a fashionable boulevard known for its cafes and intrigue. Miss Marple tucked the paper into her pocket, her mind turning to Countess Irina Volkov. The initials matched, but such evidence was circumstantial at best. In Danefield, she had once solved a case of stolen silver by tracing a monogrammed handkerchief to its owner. Here, the stakes were higher, and she would need more than initials to unravel the truth. Leaving the compartment, she sought out Pierre, who was pacing the corridor, his face etched with worry. "Monsieur Pierre," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "did Herr Brandt have any visitors last evening, before the incident?" Pierre hesitated, his eyes darting toward the dining car. "I cannot be certain," he said, "but I saw him arguing with someone in the dining car before dinner. A heated exchange, though I could not hear the words." Pressed further, he admitted to seeing Countess Volkov near Brandt's compartment later that night, her black silk gown unmistakable in the dim light. "She said she was returning to her own compartment," he added, "but I did not see her enter it." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind cataloguing this new information. The Countess's presence near the scene was significant, but Pierre's nervousness suggested he knew more than he let on. She recalled a Danefield grocer who had withheld details about a shoplifting incident, his reluctance betraying his own small role in the affair. Pierre, she suspected, was similarly entangled, perhaps by duty or fear. Returning to the dining car, Miss Marple observed the passengers now scattered in small groups, their conversations hushed. Madame Clara Voss sat alone, her flamboyant demeanour subdued, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. Roger and Evelyn Trent were at a table, Roger's notebook open before him, though he wrote nothing, his eyes fixed on the window. Countess Volkov, poised as ever, sipped coffee, her book of poetry closed beside her. Miss Marple approached Roger, her smile disarming. "Mr. Trent," she said, "I couldn't help but notice your cigar last evening. A fine brand, I believe." Roger's expression tightened, though he recovered quickly. "Havana Royale," he said, patting his jacket pocket. "A habit I picked up in London. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's reply was vague, her tone light. "Oh, just an old lady's curiosity. The scent lingers, doesn't it?" She noted his slight flush, and Evelyn's hand, resting on his arm, tightened imperceptibly. The cigar, she thought, was no mere coincidence, but whether Roger had been in Brandt's compartment or left the cigar to mislead remained unclear. Later, Miss Marple spoke with Mr. Pritchard, the bookseller who was eager to share his observations. "I saw Madame Voss in the corridor last night," he confided, lowering his voice. "She was pacing, looking quite agitated, near Brandt's door." He paused, then added, "And that Countess, she's a cool one, never says more than she must." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning to the web of connections forming among the passengers. Madame Voss's agitation, Roger's cigar, the Countess's late-night wanderings, each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. As the police began their interviews, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting a pretext for her thoughts. The cigar suggested Roger's presence, but the initials pointed to the Countess. Madame Voss's financial scandal, mentioned in passing, hinted at a motive, yet her theatrics could be a mask, and Pierre's evasiveness suggested he knew something of the train's undercurrents. Miss Marple thought of a Danefield seamstress who had hidden a theft behind tears and protestations. Here, the stakes were murder, and the deception more elaborate. The train, still stationary, seemed to hold its breath, and Miss Marple knew that the next hours would be crucial. The clue in the cigar, small though it was, had set her on a path, and she would follow it with the quiet tenacity that had unravelled so many secrets before. Chapter 5. The locked window. The night train to Berlin stirred back to life with a low, shuddering groan, its wheels grinding against the tracks as it resumed its journey toward the German capital. The local police, having completed their initial inquiries at the rural station, had allowed the train to proceed under strict supervision, with an officer stationed in the dining car to maintain order. The passengers, though relieved to be moving again, carried a palpable tension, their glances darting suspiciously as they navigated the plush corridors. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her compartment window, watched the countryside blur past, her knitting needles idle in her lap. Her mind, however, was far from idle, turning over the clues that had emerged. The cigar, the torn scrap of paper, and the lingering scent of intrigue that clung to the train like damp fog. The locked window in Herr Wilhelm Brandt's compartment had become a focal point in her thoughts. It suggested a sealed crime scene, a puzzle designed to confound, yet Miss Marple knew from her Danefield days that appearances were often deceptive. A locked room, she recalled, had once been the key to unravelling a theft at the vicarage, where a window latch had been tampered with to suggest an impossible crime. Here, the stakes were higher, and the window's role demanded closer scrutiny. With Pierre's reluctant approval, she returned to Brandt's compartment, now under police guard but accessible for her discreet examination. The compartment was much as she had left it, though the air felt heavier. The scent of cigar smoke now faint, but still discernible. The letter opener remained in Brandt's chest, a grim centrepiece, and the spilled brandy glass had been catalogued by the police. Miss Marple's eyes settled on the window, its brass latch gleaming under the morning light. She approached, careful not to disturb the scene, and examined the latch closely. There, on the metal, were faint scratches, barely visible but unmistakable to her practised eye. They were not the random marks of wear, but deliberate, suggesting someone had manipulated the mechanism, perhaps to open and close it from the outside, staging the illusion of a locked room. She stepped back, her mind racing. In Danefield, her niece's friend, a locksmith, had once explained how a skilled hand could jimmy a latch with a thin tool, leaving only subtle traces. The scratches here told a similar story, but who among the passengers had such skill? Her thoughts turned to the alibis, each as fragile as the next. Madame Clara Voss had claimed she was in her compartment at the time of the murder, but her maid, a timid girl named Elise, had hinted at a late-night walk, mentioning her mistress's restlessness. Roger and Evelyn Trent insisted they were together, but Miss Marple had noted discrepancies in their accounts. Roger claimed they retired at 11, while Evelyn mentioned a midnight stroll to the lounge car. Countess Irina Volkov, with her icy composure, had stated she was reading in her compartment, yet Pierre's sighting of her near Brandt's door cast doubt on her story. Miss Marple sought out Elise, the maid, in the service area, where the girl was folding linens with trembling hands. "Elise, my dear, Miss Marple said, her voice soft as a grandmother's. "You mentioned Madame Voss was restless last night. Did you see where she went?" Elise hesitated, her eyes wide. She went toward the private compartments, ma'am," she whispered. "I thought she was visiting a friend, but she came back upset, her hands shaking." Miss Marple nodded, patting the girl's arm, and filed this away. Madame Voss's agitation could be theatrical, but it might also conceal a purpose. Next, she approached the Trents, finding them in the lounge car, Roger's notebook now closed, his fingers tapping restlessly on the table. "Mr. Trent," Miss Marple began, her tone light, "your wife mentioned a midnight stroll last night. Did you pass Herr Brandt's compartment?" Roger's jaw tightened, but Evelyn answered first, her voice quick. "We were together, Miss Marple, just stretching our legs." Roger nodded, but his eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple noted the strain in Evelyn's smile. A young wife covering for her husband, she thought, was not uncommon. She recalled a Danefield newlywed who had lied to protect her husband's petty theft. Here, the stakes were far graver. Countess Volkov was her final stop, seated in the dining car with her book of poetry, her posture as composed as ever. Miss Marple joined her, commenting on the beauty of the passing landscape before gently steering the conversation to the murder. "Such a tragedy," she said, "and so puzzling, with the window locked tight." The Countess's fingers paused on her coffee cup, her eyes narrowing slightly. "A locked window suggests no escape," she said, her voice smooth. "Perhaps the answer lies closer to home." The cryptic remark intrigued Miss Marple, but when she mentioned the scrap of paper with the initials IV, the Countess's composure faltered, her gloved hand tightening on her pearl necklace. "Many people have such initials," she said quickly, but the flush in her cheeks betrayed her. As Miss Marple returned to her compartment, the train's steady rhythm seemed to echo her thoughts. The scratched window suggested a staged crime, but by whom? Madame Voss's late-night wanderings pointed to opportunity. Roger's cigar hinted at his presence, and the Countess's reaction to the initials suggested a hidden connection. Pierre, too, remained a question mark. His evasiveness about the argument in the dining car suggested he knew more than he admitted. Miss Marple thought of a Danefield postmistress who had once concealed a letter to protect a friend. Pierre's loyalty or fear might be similarly motivated. The police officer, a stern man named Inspector Klein, was now questioning passengers, his notebook filling with their statements. Miss Marple watched from a distance, her knitting resumed as a pretext for her observations. The passengers' alibis were unravelling, each revealing cracks under scrutiny. The locked window, she realised, was not just a clue, but a challenge, a taunt from the killer, daring the observer to see through the illusion. As the train neared Berlin, its destination now hours away, Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, not yet aligned, but closer to forming a pattern. She would need to tread carefully, for the truth, like the train, was moving inexorably forward, and she was determined to reach it before the journey's end. Chapter 6. The Berlin Connection. The night train to Berlin gathered speed as the afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the rolling fields in hues of gold and amber. The spires of the city loomed in the distance, a promise of resolution amid the mounting tension aboard the train. Passengers clustered in the dining car, their faces drawn, as Inspector Klein conducted final interviews under the watchful eye of Pierre. The air hummed with unspoken accusations, and Miss Jane Marple, seated at a corner table with her knitting, observed it all with the quiet intensity of a cat watching mice. The clues she had gathered, the cigar, the torn paper, the scratched window, had coalesced in her mind, forming a pattern as clear as the intricate stitches of her shawl. It was time to draw the threads together. She had spent the journey piecing together Herr Wilhelm Brandt's hidden life. The initials IV on the scrap of paper had led her to discreet inquiries among the passengers and staff. Mr. Pritchard, the bookseller, had proven unexpectedly useful, confiding over tea that Brandt was no mere diplomat, but a figure entangled in wartime shadows. "Espionage," they whispered, he said, his voice low. "He handled secrets during the war. Codes, agents, the lot. Berlin was a nest of spies back then." The partial address, Kurfürstendamm 22, pointed to a discreet safe house in the city's heart, a place known in certain circles for discreet meetings. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Countess Irina Volkov. Her guarded references to old wounds and her émigré status suggested more than exile. She had been an operative, recruited in the chaos of revolution, her path crossing Brandt's in the shadowed alleys of pre-war Berlin. Roger Trent's role clarified next. His journalistic probing was no idle curiosity. He had been chasing a story on Brandt's post-war dealings, documents that could expose a lingering espionage ring profiting from black market arms. Miss Marple had overheard him murmuring to Evelyn about the list, the names that could topple ministries. The cigar in Brandt's compartment was his, left during a clandestine visit to confront the diplomat and demand the papers. Madame Clara Voss, meanwhile, provided the smokescreen. Her financial scandal was real, a diversion of opera funds traced back to Brandt's accounts, used to launder spy money. She had quarrelled with him not over music, but repayment, her hysterics a bid to deflect scrutiny. The locked window, with its telltale scratches, sealed the deception. Someone had entered from the corridor, stabbed Brandt in a fit of rage, then manipulated the latch to suggest isolation, perhaps using a hairpin or thin blade, tools as common as they were overlooked. Countess Volkov, with her precise movements and hidden past, fit the method. Miss Marple recalled a Danefield housemaid who had staged a burglary with a similar trick, her vanity case holding the damning tool. Here, the pearl necklace the Countess clutched so tightly might conceal more than jewels. Satisfied, Miss Marple rose and addressed Pierre. "Monsieur, if you would be so kind as to summon the passengers to the dining car, there is a matter that requires clarity before we reach Berlin." Pierre, pale but compliant, complied, and soon the car filled. Madame Voss dabbing her eyes, the Trents side by side, Countess Volkov erect and unreadable, Mr. Pritchard fidgeting, and Inspector Klein watching with sceptical interest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, her voice soft yet carrying the weight of authority. "This tragedy need not confound us longer. Herr Brandt's death stems from secrets long buried. Countess Volkov, you are no casual traveller. You and Brandt shared a wartime past, an espionage ring that endured beyond the armistice. The safe house on Kurfürstendamm held your mutual ledgers, didn't it?" The Countess's lips thinned, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, turning to Roger. "Mr. Trent, your Havana Royale cigar betrays your visit. You sought his documents, argued perhaps, but left him alive. The ash you left was your undoing." Roger flushed, nodding reluctantly. I took nothing. He threatened me, said he'd ruin my career. And Madame Voss, Miss Marple said gently, your funds from the opera were entangled in his schemes. You argued in the dining car, as Pierre witnessed, over money he refused to return. The singer gasped theatrically, but her eyes darted to the Countess. Miss Marple faced Volkov squarely. The paper with your initials fell during your confrontation. You entered his compartment after midnight. Pierre saw your gown. In rage, fearing exposure, you seized the letter opener. The precise wound speaks of your skill, honed in shadows. Then the window, scratched from inside to mimic impossibility, a ploy I've seen in humbler settings. The Countess rose, her composure shattering. Enough! She cried, her accent thickening. Yes, I killed him. He would have betrayed me, sent me back to face the Bolsheviks. The ring was our lifeline. He grew greedy, threatened to sell our names. Had no choice. She sank into her seat, tears streaking her face, as Inspector Klein signalled his men. Miss Marple watched calmly as the Countess was led away, the confession hanging in the air. Roger admitted his intrusion fully, swearing Brandt lived when he left. Evelyn confessed to fabricating their alibi, her loyalty blinding her. Madame Voss, cornered, revealed her debts but denied violence. Even Pierre admitted overhearing the Countess's threat earlier, silenced by fear of scandal. As the train pulled into Berlin's Grand Station, its platforms alive with uniforms and flashing lights, Lady Beatrice Langley awaited, her face alight with relief. "Jane, you've done it again!" she exclaimed, embracing her friend. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Merely observation, my dear. Human nature is predictable, from Danefield lanes to Berlin rails." The symposium proceeded amid the bustle, discussions of detective fiction enriched by the night's real drama. Yet as Miss Marple retired to her hotel, the city's lights twinkling below, her thoughts lingered on the train, not the murder, but the frailties that birthed it. Greed, fear, old loyalties twisted into betrayal. The night train to Berlin had carried more than passengers. It had borne the weight of the past, and she had lightened it, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 7. The Resolution. The night train to Berlin rolled to a final stop at the city's Grand Hauptbahnhof, its iron arches and glass dome gleaming under the late afternoon sun. The platform bustled with activity as Berlin's police, alerted by Inspector Klein's telegrams, awaited the passengers with stern efficiency. Countess Irina Volkov, her wrists bound by discreet cuffs, was escorted from the train, her pale face set in a mask of defiance that barely concealed her exhaustion. The other passengers, their nerves frayed by the journey's grim events, disembarked with hurried steps, eager to escape the confines of the train that had become a stage for murder. Miss Jane Marple, however, lingered at the platform's edge, her modest suitcase in hand, her eyes scanning the crowd with the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved. Inspector Klein approached her, his notebook tucked under his arm, his expression a mix of respect and bemusement. "Fräulein Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "your assistance was unconventional but invaluable. The Countess's confession has spared us much trouble." Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile gentle. "Merely a matter of listening, Inspector. People reveal more than they intend, if one knows where to look." Klein nodded, though his furrowed brow suggested he was unaccustomed to such understated methods. He departed to oversee the formalities, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The dining car confession had unravelled the final threads of the mystery. But Miss Marple had not been content to rest on the Countess's admission alone. Earlier, as the train neared Berlin, she had pressed Roger Trent for further clarity. Seated in the lounge car, his face pale under the weight of scrutiny, Roger admitted to sneaking into Brandt's compartment after their argument in the dining car. "I wanted those documents," he confessed, his voice low. "They named names, politicians, brokers, spies still active. I thought I could expose them, make my name as a journalist." He swore he had left Brandt alive, the cigar stub an accidental trace of his presence. Evelyn, sitting beside him, her hands clasped tightly, admitted to her lie about their midnight stroll. "I was afraid for him," she whispered. "I thought he'd done it, and I couldn't bear to lose him." Miss Marple, her tone kind but probing, had turned to Madame Clara Voss next. The opera singer, her flamboyant veneer cracked, sat in the dining car, her auburn hair pinned haphazardly. "Yes, I quarrelled with Brandt," she admitted, her voice stripped of its usual theatrics. "He swindled me, used my opera's funds for his dirty deals. I demanded my money back, but he laughed at me." Her hysterics on discovering the body, she confessed, were partly genuine shock, partly a calculated performance to deflect suspicion. "I thought if I seemed distraught, no one would look too closely." Miss Marple nodded, recalling a Danefield shopkeeper who had used tears to mask a theft. Madame Voss's act was more polished, but no less transparent to her keen eye. Pierre, the conductor, had been the last to yield his piece of the puzzle. Cornered in the service area, his nervous demeanour gave way under Miss Marple's gentle persistence. "I heard the Countess threaten Brandt," he admitted, his hands twisting his cap. "In the corridor, before dinner, she said, 'You'll pay for betraying us.' I kept quiet, fearing for my job. This train, it carries powerful people." Miss Marple's smile was sympathetic, but her mind noted his fear of scandal, a motive as old as Danefield's gossip circles. As she stood on the platform, the city's pulse thrumming around her, Miss Marple pieced together the final picture. Countess Volkov, driven by fear of exposure, had killed Brandt in a moment of desperation. Her wartime past a chain she could not break. Roger's ambition had led him to the edge of the crime, his cigar a careless clue. Evelyn's loyalty had blinded her to truth, and Madame Voss's greed had entangled her in the web, though not as the killer. Pierre's silence, born of duty, had delayed the truth but not obscured it. Each passenger, like villagers in Danefield, had acted from motives as human as they were flawed: fear, ambition, love, greed. Lady Beatrice Langley emerged from the crowd, her elegant coat a splash of colour against the grey platform. "Jane, my dear," she exclaimed, embracing her friend, "you've turned our literary journey into a detective triumph. The symposium will be abuzz with your tale." Miss Marple chuckled, softly, deflecting the praise. "It's merely observation, Beatrice. A train, like a village, holds its secrets in plain sight." Beatrice laughed, linking arms with her as they moved toward a waiting car. "You must tell me everything over tea," she insisted. "Berlin's cafes are divine." The symposium, held in a grand hall lined with books and portraits, was a lively affair, with scholars debating the nuances of mystery and motive. Miss Marple, seated quietly among them, found her thoughts drifting back to the train. The discussions of fictional detectives, Poirot, Holmes' whimsy, felt distant compared to the real drama of human nature she had witnessed. She spoke little, her contributions modest but incisive. earning nods from the academics who mistook her simplicity for quaintness. That evening, in her hotel room overlooking Berlin's twinkling lights, Miss Marple unpacked her suitcase, her fingers brushing the pale blue shawl she had barely touched during the journey. She sat by the window, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. The night train to Berlin had carried her into a world of intrigue, but its lessons were familiar. People, whether in a village or a city, were driven by the same passions, their secrets as predictable as the seasons. She smiled, thinking of Danefield's quiet lanes, where she would soon return. The train's mystery was solved, but human nature, she knew, would always offer another puzzle to unravel.